I'm Medusa.
Now, I know what you're thinking. Medusa? That monster from Greek mythology? The one with the bad hair day that never ends? Yeah, that one. Don't worry. We'll get into all of it. And trust me, her story is wild. I mean, Greek myths are already pretty crazy, but Medusa's tail cranks that dial up to 11. It's got everything. Gods behaving badly, a curse, a hero on a quest, magical items, decapitation, you name it. It might sound intense, but we're gonna keep it chill, nice and easy, like a late-night story among friends. So, who was Medusa, really? Let's start with the basics, the origin story, the good stuff. Medusa is best known from Greek mythology. You probably know the image. A monstrous woman with living snakes for hair and a gaze that can literally turn people into stone statues. Fun at parties, right? Honestly, she's one of the most iconic figures from any mythology. I mean, you see a picture of a lady with snake hair and you immediately think Medusa. She's basically a celebrity monster at this point. Now, Medusa wasn't an only child in the monster world. She actually had two sisters, named Stheno and Euryale. The three of them together were called the Gorgons. Sounds kind of like a rock band, doesn't it? Ladies and gentlemen, give it up for Stheno, Euryale, and Medusa, the Gorgons. But in Greek, Gorgon basically means dreadful or terrifying. And, well, that fits. Her sisters were immortal monsters, convenient for them. But Medusa was the odd one out. She was mortal. Yup, out of the three fearsome sisters, Medusa was the only one who could actually be killed. Talk about drawing the short straw in the monster sibling lottery. So where did a trio of snake-haired ladies come from? Anyway, in the myths, their parents were ancient sea deities named Phorcys and Ceto. Now, Phorcys and Ceto had a pretty interesting family portfolio. Basically a bunch of monsters. We're talking sea serpents, dragons, a half-woman, half-snake lady. You know, standard dysfunctional family stuff. Medusa's other relatives supposedly included the Gree. Those are the Grey sisters, who shared one eye and one tooth between them. A dragon named Ladon, and even Echidna, who was a half-woman, half-snake creature often called the mother of all monsters. So yeah, Medusa's family reunions would have been absolutely bonkers. Imagine the catering. Do we have enough raw meat for the dragon? And someone keep an eye on Uncle Kraken, he's had too much Poseidon punch. But hey race the thing, Medusa wasn't born with a face that could petrify a guy at 10 paces. In fact, one of the most interesting twists is that Medusa was said to be born beautiful. Yep, according to some myths, especially later Roman versions like by the poet Ovid, Medusa started out as a mortal woman who was absolutely gorgeous. Hard to imagine, right? One ancient author even gushes about her hair, saying it was her crowning glory, long, shiny, and beautiful. You know, before it turned into a nest of vipers. So how does someone go from beauty queen to snake-headed terror? Buckle up, because this is where the Greek gods come in and things get messy. Like many Greek myths, it starts with a god who just couldn't keep it in his toga. The story goes that Medusa caught the eye of Poseidon. You know, the god of the sea, brother of Zeus, big beard, carries a trident, that guy. Poseidon was apparently really into Medusa's beauty. I mean, join the club, right? But hey race the problem. Medusa was a priestess in the temple of Athena, the goddess of wisdom, and Athena was all about that vow of chastity for her priestesses. So one day, depending on the version, Poseidon either seduced Medusa or straight up forced himself on her right there in Athena's temple. Not cool on so many levels, I know. It was basically the ultimate desecration of Athena's sacred space. Now, you'd think Athena's wrath would be aimed squarely at Poseidon for turning her temple into his personal love shack, right? But nope. In a classic case of misdirected goddess rage, Athena took it out on Medusa instead. Athena was furious that her sacred temple had been defiled. Perhaps she was jealous of Medusa's beauty, or maybe she was just super upset about the violation of her shrine. Myths differ on the motive. Either way, Athena's punishment was brutal. She cursed Medusa, transforming that lovely hair into a writhing mass of poisonous snakes. And as a bonus, because Greek curses always come with an extra kick, she made it so that anyone who looked directly at Medusa's face would turn to solid stone on the spot. Talk about an extreme makeover, huh? One day you're known for your gorgeous locks. The next day your hair is literally hissing at you. And it wasn't just the hair and the deadly stare. The curse basically turned Medusa into a full-on monster. According to some descriptions, her skin turned ashen or greenish. She grew fangs, possibly even boar-like tusks protruding from her mouth, and her hands became bronze. Yeah, metal hands, not sure how that works biologically, but it sounds terrifying. Some accounts say she even got wings of gold. Basically, Athena went all out, turning Medusa from a beautiful maiden into something so horrifying that just seeing her would make your blood run cold. Right before you literally froze like a statue. So there's Medusa, newly cursed and looking like a nightmare. What does she do now? Well, in myth, when someone gets turned into a monster, the career options are pretty limited. Medusa ends up basically hiding away from the world. Depending on the myth, she and her Gorgon sisters took up residence somewhere really remote. Some say a far western island beyond the edge of the known world. Others say maybe somewhere in Libya or just generally way over there where no one will bother us. I mean, if your face turned anyone who saw it into stone, you'd probably become a recluse too, right? Not exactly easy to have neighbors or throw house parties when every visitor ends up as a lawn ornament. And indeed, anyone stupid or unlucky enough to stumble upon Medusa's lair would have been in for a very stiff surprise. Badum TSS. The whole turning to stone thing is one of the creepiest powers ever. Imagine you're some ancient Greek hero wannabe wandering around, and you walk into a cave and see statues of men in fighting poses all over the place. At first, you're like, oh, cool art. And then you notice the statues are wearing real armor and have this look of terror on their faces. That's when you realize they aren't statues at all. They're the poor saps who came there before you and accidentally looked Medusa in the eyes. Surprise! You're in Medusa's house, buddy. Cue the creeping dread. Now, you might wonder, how did Medusa go from minding her own business in a far-off hideaway to getting hunted by a hero? Enter Perseus. Perseus is basically one of those Greek hero dudes. Think of him like a demigod adventurer running around doing quests. In fact, Perseus's dad was the king of the gods himself, Zeus. Yep, the big boss god. So Perseus had a bit of divine edge in his bloodline. His mom was Danae, a mortal princess. There's a whole story about how Zeus came to her as a golden rain, weird flex, Zeus, and that's how Perseus was conceived. But let's not digress too far into Zeus's creative seduction tactics. The point is, Perseus is our hero in this story, and his adventure is about to collide with poor Medusa. So why on earth would anyone want to seek out a snake-headed lady who can kill you with a glance? Good question. The answer, as with many things in life and myth, comes down to a king being a total jerk. Perseus's mom Danae was being harassed by this king named Polydectes, the ruler of a little island called Seriphos, where Perseus and his mom had ended up. Polydectes wanted to force Danae to marry him, and Perseus was not cool with that. Understandably, Polydectes decides to get rid of Perseus by sending him on a suicide mission. The king pretends he's getting married to someone else and asks every man in the kingdom to bring a wedding gift of a horse. Perseus, who didn't have a horse and possibly to save face in front of others, boasts, I could just as easily bring you the head of Medusa as a gift. Polydectes, being a sly jerk, is like, great idea, off you go then. Bring me Medusa's head. Basically, he calls Perseus's bluff and sets him up with an impossible task, hoping Perseus will become garden statuary somewhere and stop being a problem. So Perseus is like, welp, I guess I'm really doing this. He's basically been dared into fetching the scariest head in the world. Fortunately for Perseus, he wasn't doing this alone. He had some divine help. Remember, his dad is Zeus, so he's got connections. The gods Athena and Hermes both decide to assist our guy Perseus. Athena probably had a vested interest in seeing Medusa taken down, considering Athena's the one who cursed her in the first place. Messed up, but it is what it is. Now, Greek heroes are basically like RPG characters. They need the right gear before a boss fight. So the gods hooked Perseus up with some legendary items. First, Athena gave him a shiny bronze shield polished to a mirror finish. This was crucial because, as you may know, you can't just stroll up to Medusa and make eye contact unless you want to spend eternity as a lawn statue. The mirror-like shield would allow Perseus to see Medusa without directly looking at her. Smart, right? Hermes, the messenger god, gave Perseus a special sword, sometimes described as a curved blade or a sickle, like a celestial machete perfect for lopping off Gorgon heads. Hermes also let Perseus borrow his winged sandals because if you're going to fight a monster, you might as well do it with style and the power of flight, right? On top of that, Perseus got another useful item, Hades' Helm of Invisibility, basically a magic cap that makes you vanish. Yes, like a proto-invisibility cloak, Harry Potter style. And as if that wasn't enough, the gods provided a magic bag called a kibisis to safely contain Medusa's head afterward, because you really don't want to just stuff a severed, snake-haired head in your regular backpack. It might leak or something. Plus, accidental petrification if it's peeking out. Now, even with all that gear, Perseus had to actually find Medusa. GPS wasn't a thing, obviously, so he had to ask around. But you can't just show up at the local tavern and be like, anyone know the way to the cursed Snake Lady's cave? Instead, Perseus went to some other creepy figures known as the Gree, remember them? The Gree were those 3 old witchy sisters of the Gorgons who shared one eye and one tooth. They were basically living in some dark place and had all the secrets. To get their help, Perseus kind of stole their eye. Yeah, he waited till one was passing the single eyeball to another because they literally passed the eyeball around to see, and he snatched it mid-transfer. Ball's a move, not gonna lie. He basically said, I've got your eye, ladies, and I'll give it back if you tell me how to find Medusa and where to get the cool gadgets. After some haggling, and probably a lot of shrieking from 3 blind old hags fumbling around, they coughed up the info. They directed Perseus to some nymphs or to the Hesperides, depending on the version, who then provided those magical items we talked about, the sandals, the bag, etc. And they also gave directions to the Gorgon's lair. Only after securing all that did Perseus return the eye. Remember, kids, don't try this with your grandmas. Armed with all this gear and intel, Perseus finally heads off to face Medusa. Picture it. Perseus flying through the air with winged sandals, rocking Hades' invisibility helmet, shield in one hand, sword in the other, magic bag slung at his side. Basically an ancient Greek superhero at this point. He reaches the land of the Gorgons, which is often described as this desolate place on the edge of the world. The ground is littered with stone statues of unfortunate travelers and would-be heroes. A graveyard of would-be victors who are now just stone decor. Now, Medusa and her sisters are apparently snoozing when he arrives. Yep, they're asleep. Which, honestly, is probably the best scenario for Perseus because fighting 3 awake Gorgons, 2 of whom are immortal, is a no-go. So Perseus, being sneaky and invisible thanks to that helmet, creeps up on the sleeping Medusa. He uses the reflective shield as a mirror to see her without catching the direct gaze. It must have been a super tense moment. One wrong move and he could literally become stone before he ever swings that sword. But he manages to position himself just right, aims that divine blade, and whack. Off goes Medusa's head in one swift slice. Cue the dramatic moment. Boom. Sudden chaos. Medusa's head is off her shoulders, and from her neck springs a freaking winged horse. I'm not even kidding, this is Greek mythology, folks, where decapitations sometimes lead to surprise horse births. The instant Medusa is killed, out pops Pegasus, the famous white-winged horse, flying straight out of her neck. Talk about a birth story. Mom, how was I born? Oh, you emerged fully grown from your dead mother's neck, sweetie. Along with Pegasus, another being comes out, a giant warrior named Chrysaor, who wields a golden sword. These 2 are Medusa's children by Poseidon, who were apparently gestating in her, invisibly, and got released when Perseus did his slice and dice. It's completely bonkers, but that's the myth for you. Naturally, the noise of all this, the swish of the sword, the thud of Medusa's body, probably Pegasus neighing in confusion, wakes up Stheno and Euryale, the 2 immortal Gorgon sisters. And they are not happy. I mean, if someone broke into your house and harmed your sister, you'd be mad too, right? The 2 sisters start freaking out, wailing and thrashing around, trying to find the intruder. But remember, Perseus has that invisibility helmet on, so they can't see him. Plus, he's got Medusa's head in the bag now, so he's kind of like, mission accomplished, time to get out of there. Hermes' winged sandals come in very handy here. Perseus lifts off into the sky like, "So long, suckers," leaving the other two Gorgons screaming in impotent rage below. Let's indulge in a little scene visualization here. Because why not? Imagine Perseus entering Medusa's lair. The air is cold and still. Maybe there's a dripping sound from a damp cave ceiling, echoing softly. Statues of past victims stand around like a creepy sculpture garden, their faces frozen in fear. Perseus, wearing Hades' helm, is invisible, but he's not invulnerable. One wrong step, one slip of the foot on a pebble, could wake the Gorgons in an instant. He grips that polished shield in one hand, holding it up like a rearview mirror to navigate. In its reflection, he catches flickers of movement, the snakes on Medusa's head, even as she sleeps, gently writhing. His heart must be pounding. Wouldn't yours be? Step by step, he follows the reflection, edging closer. He can probably hear the soft hissing of the snakes, maybe Medusa mumbling or snoring. Do Gorgons snore? Who knows? His sword is raised, arm trembling because he has to strike with one blow. If he fails, he's done for. I can almost feel the tension. Finally, in the reflection, he sees the moment, her neck exposed. This is it. Swish! He brings the sword down in a flash. There's a thud, an unearthly howl as the sisters awaken, and Perseus almost drops the shield in shock as he sees in the mirror snakes flailing wildly where Medusa's head used to be. He's done it. Talk about an adrenaline rush. And honestly, in that moment, maybe pity mixes with his relief. What a gruesome destiny for Medusa, but no time for hesitation. He shoves the head into the magic bag before any stray gaze can catch him, and then hightails it out of there as Stheno and Euryale shriek vengeance into the void. Phew, I get goosebumps thinking about how that story must have been told by bards of old, making their audience hold their breath until the very end. Now, what's a hero to do with a severed Gorgon head in his bag? Well, if you're Perseus, you make the most of it. The Medusa head is like the ultimate portable weapon, a literal head of doom that can still turn anything that looks at it into stone, even after it's been disconnected from its body. Talk about keeping your power after death. So Perseus flies home, but he doesn't go straight to Polydectes' palace. On the way, he actually has a few side adventures, like any good hero. One famous side quest, Perseus passes by the Titan Atlas, the giant dude who holds up the sky. Atlas isn't very hospitable to Perseus. Long story short, Atlas kind of dismisses him or threatens him, and Perseus is like, "All right, big guy, have it your way." He pulls out Medusa's head and zap, turns Atlas into stone. Supposedly that's how we got the Atlas Mountains in North Africa. The myth says the stony Titan became a whole mountain range. Geology by Gorgon, if you will. It's a neat little story that explains geography. Atlas shrugged? Nah, Atlas got stoned. And it doesn't stop there. Perseus also famously saved a princess on his way back. You might have heard of Andromeda, not just a galaxy. She was originally a princess in Greek myth. Perseus found Andromeda chained to a rock by the sea, about to be eaten by a sea monster, because her parents had ticked off Poseidon. Long story involving boastful claims and a vengeful sea god. Classic stuff. So Perseus swoops in. Now, in some versions, he uses Medusa's head to petrify the sea monster Cetus that's coming for Andromeda. In other versions, he just goes full action hero and slices the monster up with his sword. Either way, he saves the princess, woohoo. And, because this is how myths roll, Perseus promptly marries Andromeda. Nothing bonds a couple quite like slaying a monster together on the first date. Am I right? Eventually, Perseus gets back to the island of Seriphos, where that whole fiasco started. Remember King Polydectes, the dirtbag who sent Perseus on this mission hoping he'd die? Yeah, that guy. Well, Polydectes has been bothering Danae this whole time, thinking Perseus is as good as dead. So Perseus walks into the court, and Polydectes is like, "So, you got my wedding gift?" Probably with a smug little grin, assuming Perseus failed. And Perseus is all, "You bet I did." Then, you guessed it, he whips out Medusa's head from the bag as proof. Cue instant petrification of Polydectes and all his cronies. They all lock eyes with that head and turn to stone like a bunch of grotesque statues mid-party. Honestly, it's one of the most savage mic drops in Greek mythology. presenting the proof of your quest by using it to literally stone the dude who asked for it. And then there's the Polydectes smackdown. I always imagine that scene as a total mic drop moment. Polydectes is feasting with his yes men, probably congratulating himself on getting rid of Perseus. Suddenly, Perseus strolls in, probably all dusty and exhausted from his journey. Polydectes might sputter, "What are you doing here? Where's my gift?" Fully expecting Perseus to have nothing. Perseus then says, essentially, "Oh, I got you a gift, all right. Feast your eyes on this." And he whips out Medusa's head. For a split second, stunned silence, then stone sounds. Maybe a series of crackling noises as everyone in the room freezes in whatever position they were in. Polydectes, with his arrogant face, probably turns into a lifeless statue mid-smirk. I wonder if Perseus had to pry the stone statue of Polydectes off his mom, since the king might have been holding on to Danae when he got stoned. Okay, maybe I'm embellishing, but it's quite a tableau to think about. The story doesn't detail Danae's reaction. One minute she's being harassed by a creep. Next minute the creep is literally a chunk of marble. I'd like to think she just sighed in relief and said, "Good riddance." Perseus, having cleaned house, sets things right on the island. Some tellings say he made Polydectes' brother the new king, who was a better dude. And then Perseus and his mom head home. A happy ending for the good guys, at least. With Polydectes taken care of and his mother safe, Perseus basically had no more use for this terrifying head. But you don't just toss something like that in the garbage. It's divine. It's cursed. Basically a biohazard, really. So Perseus decided to give Medusa's head as a gift, or offering, to Athena, the goddess who helped him. Athena, being the practical war goddess she is, placed the head onto her shield called the Aegis. Some say she actually set it in the center of her breastplate, but often it's depicted on the shield. This turned Athena's shield into an even scarier weapon. Imagine facing a shield that's literally flashing the severed head of Medusa at you. That's a one-way ticket to Stone Town. The image of Medusa's head on Athena's shield or armor is called the Gorgonian, and it became a common symbol of protection, the irony. The thing that scared everyone was used to ward off evil. Essentially, Medusa's face became a protective talisman, the ultimate spooky decor to keep bad guys away. Keep bad guys away. And believe it or not, the story still doesn't end there. Even in death, Medusa kept contributing to the myth world in weird ways. Remember how she was pregnant with Poseidon's children, Pegasus and the giant? When she died? Well, aside from birthing those two on the spot, her blood had magical properties too. As Perseus was flying home over the desert of Libya, legend says that drops of Medusa's blood fell onto the sand and instantly turned into snakes. Essentially, that was a mythical explanation for why there are so many venomous snakes in North Africa. Oh, they sprouted from Medusa's blood splatter. Gross? Yes. Creative? Also yes. But wait, there's more. Athena took some of Medusa's blood and gave it to a famed healer, the demigod Asclepius, who's basically the Greek god of medicine. And this wasn't your ordinary blood donation. It was like a 2-in-1 magical potion. According to myth, blood from Medusa's right side had the power to resurrect the dead, while blood from her left side was an instant deadly poison. Talk about a dual-use substance. Asclepius supposedly used the magical blood to perform miraculous cures and even bring people back to life, which eventually ticked off Zeus, because bringing back the dead was a big no-no. But that's another story. So Medusa's blood was basically the ultimate medicine and the ultimate toxin, depending on which vial you opened. Athena didn't stop there. She also took a lock of Medusa's hair. Some versions say a lock in place of giving the head itself, or in addition to it, and later gave that lock of hair to another hero, Heracles, a.k.a. Hercules. Hercules, in turn, gave this lock of Medusa's hair to the daughter of a king, the princess of a city called Tegea, to use as a weapon of last resort. Here's how that worked. If enemies were attacking Tegea, the princess was supposed to stand on the city walls and hold up Medusa's hair. Yep, just a single lock of that snake hair, to scare the enemies away. Apparently, even one lock of Medusa's hair, without the eyes, still had some kind of terror-inducing power. One story says when this lock was exposed, It created a huge storm, and the sight of it was so frightening it sent the enemy army into a panicked retreat. I guess even a little piece of Medusa was nothing to sniff at. So, to recap the myth in a nutshell, beautiful woman gets cursed into a monster, monster gets head chopped off by a hero, and then that head and even her blood go on to do a bunch more weird magical stuff. Honestly, it's a lot. Medusa's story is one of the more jam-packed myths out there. You've got tragedy. She basically got punished for being a victim, or at best for a situation largely out of her control. You've got horror, the whole turning people to stone and the snake hair, classic nightmare fuel. And you've got this almost darkly comic aftermath where her severed head is like the hottest commodity on Olympus, being passed around to slay and heal and protect. It's no wonder Medusa became such a legendary figure. Now, beyond the myth itself, Medusa's image had a life of its own in the ancient world. The ancient Greeks, and later the Romans, were actually kind of obsessed with the Gorgon face. Her head full of snakes and horrifying expression was used as a symbol to ward off evil. Kind of funny if you think about it. The visage of one of the scariest beings ever was thought to scare away other bad stuff. It's like fighting fire with fire. You'd see images of Medusa's face, the Gorgonian, on shields, breastplates, coins, doorway lintels, all over the place to protect buildings or people. Warriors might engrave it on their armor, like, "Don't mess with me. I've got scary snake lady backing me up." Even Alexander the Great was said to have worn a breastplate with a Medusa head depicted on it. It was the ancient equivalent of wearing a big skull emblem or a monster picture to look intimidating. In essence, Medusa's face became one of the ultimate ancient logos, a symbol conveying power, protection, and stay away. It beats a corporate swoosh, if intimidation is the goal. What's also interesting is how artists in different periods portrayed Medusa. In the oldest Greek art, we're talking 6th century BC vases and temple carvings, she's depicted as utterly grotesque, like nightmare fuel on steroids. Bulging, staring eyes, a lolling tongue sticking out, fanged teeth, sometimes even a beard. Yes, some early depictions gave Medusa a beard. Talk about a bad hair day. She wasn't even clearly female in those early images. Just a monstrous face meant to shock and repel. Often you'd see that face, the Gorgonian, carved on temples as a protective symbol, basically an ancient jump scare to ward off evil spirits or intruders. But as time went on, especially by the time of the Romans and then later in the Renaissance period, Medusa started getting a makeover. She was still scary, but artists also made her weirdly beautiful or at least pitiful. They might show her face as that of a beautiful woman but with snakes in her hair, or they'd give her a look of sorrow in her eyes as if to say, "I'm a monster, but it's not really my fault." Some of the most famous art pieces involving Medusa highlight that mix of horror and beauty. For example, the Italian painter Caravaggio painted a famous Medusa on a ceremonial shield. It shows her face at the very moment she's decapitated, eyes wide, mouth open in a silent scream, snakes writhing. It's chilling. And yet, it's kind of beautiful in a haunting way, painted with Caravaggio's signature realism. Another one, the sculptor Bernini did a marble bust of Medusa that's on display in Rome. In that sculpture, her face isn't grotesque at all. Instead, Bernini shows her looking aghast, almost like she's horrified at what she's become, with snakes curling around her head. You can see the humanity in her expression, as if the curse is something truly tragic. It's a very different take from the tongue-wagging monster of earlier Greek art. Of course, plenty of art just goes for the classic heroic angle, like the famous bronze sculpture by Benvenuto Cellini of Perseus holding up Medusa's severed head. That one's in Florence, in a public square, and it basically screams, "Behold, the hero triumphs over the monster," in glorious Renaissance style. Fun fact, when that statue was unveiled in the 1550s, people were apparently a bit squeamish about how realistically Cellini sculpted Medusa's head, blood and all. I mean, the head in the statue has snakes in the hair and blood gushing from the neck. Cellini even sculpted the blood as snakes spiraling out. Wild artistic touch. Caused a mix of awe and you in the crowd. It was sort of the 16th century version of a gore effect that had people talking. Nowadays, some people interpret Medusa in a very different light. Instead of just a monster, She's sometimes seen as a symbol of female rage or a victim turned powerful. Given that her backstory, in Ovid's telling, involves being assaulted and then punished for it, you can see why modern readers might say, "Hold on, Medusa got a raw deal." In recent decades, Medusa has even been embraced as a feminist icon by some. There's a famous essay by feminist philosopher Helene Sixtus called The Laugh of the Medusa, encouraging women to find their voice and power, and it uses Medusa as a positive figure, like saying, she actually laughs and isn't defeated at all. The idea is kind of reclaiming Medusa. Her gaze turns men to stone, which could be seen as a metaphor for women's rage or power halting male aggression. In fact, Medusa has even become a symbol for survivors of sexual assault, a sort of emblem of the anger and strength that comes from trauma. Some reinterpret Athena's actions in a more sympathetic way, suggesting that maybe, just maybe, Athena transformed Medusa not purely to punish her, but to protect her, making her so no man could ever hurt her again. It's not the traditional interpretation Athena was likely being punitive in the myth, but it shows how people can reinvent myths to find meaning. A striking example. In 2020, a statue was unveiled in New York City directly inspired by this reinterpretation. It's by artist Luciano Garbati, titled Medusa with the Head of Perseus. Yup, you heard that right. It flips the old Selene statue around. This sculpture shows Medusa standing tall, naked, holding a sword in one hand and Perseus's severed head in the other. Her expression isn't triumphant in a gloating way. It's more solemn, resolute. They placed it near a courthouse where high-profile abuse cases were heard, as a #MeTooEra statement. The once victim is now the one with power, literally holding the head of the aggressor. It's pretty intense and on the nose, but it encapsulates how dramatically the narrative around Medusa can shift. Alright, heavy stuff aside, Medusa also pops up all over pop culture just because, let's face it, she's cool in a scary monster way. If you're into movies, you might remember Medusa in the classic 1981 film, Clash of the Titans. If you haven't seen it, picture old-school stop-motion animation bringing this snake lady to life. It's actually pretty awesome for its time. In that movie, Medusa is portrayed with a snake-like lower body. Basically, from the waist down, she's like a giant snake, and from the waist up, the Medusa we know, humanoid with snake hair. They really leaned into the horror aspect. She's lurking in the shadows of her temple with a bow and arrow, sniping Perseus's companions one by one. We only see her in brief, suspenseful glimpses until the final confrontation. That portrayal gave a lot of kids and adults nightmares, let me tell you. The special effects wizard Ray Harryhausen crafted that Medusa sequence, and it's iconic, scary, tense, and strangely poignant when she finally gets defeated, because you almost feel a twinge of pity for her amidst the horror. Then there was the 2010 Clash of the Titans remake. They did Medusa with full modern CGI. Again, she's half snake, half woman in that one, with a face that can shift from beautiful to demonic in an instant. Honestly, she's portrayed as more straight-up villainous in the remake, not much sympathy. She's just a monster to be slain in a high-octane action scene. Though the CGI did allow her to move with a really eerie, fast serpentine motion, which was visually neat. If you're a Percy Jackson fan, the books or the movie, Medusa shows up there too. In Percy Jackson and the Olympians, the lightning thief, Percy, who is a modern kid and ironically the son of Poseidon in that series, encounters Medusa working undercover at a place called Auntie EMS Garden Emporium, basically a garden statuary shop. Medusa is hiding in plain sight, turning people to stone and selling them as garden statues. Dark humor there. In that modern twist, she wears a veil and sunglasses to avoid petrifying people by accident, until she's ready to strike. Percy and his friends manage to defeat her. Yes, there's a beheading. Some things never change. And in a cheeky move, Percy then mails Medusa's severed head to Mount Olympus, in the books, or uses it on his evil stepfather in the movie. Either way, a bit of modern revenge via Gorgon. Medusa's a staple in video games as well, often as an enemy or boss you have to defeat. The God of War series, for example, features Medusa and other Gorgons as monsters Kratos encounters. In the very first God of War game, Kratos actually rips off Medusa's head, yikes, and then uses the head as a weapon to turn other enemies to stone for a short time. It's very brutal, but basically a direct nod to the mythic trope of using Medusa's head as a weapon. The Castlevania games famously have those super annoying Medusa head enemies that just fly across the screen in a wave pattern and knock you into pits. Anyone who's played Castlevania likely has traumatic flashbacks of those. They're literally just flying female heads with snakes for hair. Not even the full Medusa body, but they definitely petrify your patience if nothing else. In Dungeons and Dragons and a lot of fantasy literature, Medusa, with a lowercase m, often refers to a whole species or category of creature, rather than one unique individual. So you might encounter a Medusa in a dungeon meaning some snake-haired lady monster, who isn't necessarily the Medusa of myth, but the idea is the same. Funnily, D&D also has a creature called a Gorgon, but in classic D&D that term refers to something completely different. A large bull-like monster that breathes petrifying gas. Basically a metal bull that snorts out fumes to turn you to stone. Why use the name Gorgon for that? Who knows? Early D&D was weird like that. Meanwhile, the snake-haired petrifying lady is just called a Medusa in the game. So if you're ever playing D&D, don't expect a Gorgon to look like Medusa, or you'll be very confused when a bull comes charging at you. Even in comic books, we see nods to Medusa. Marvel Comics has a character literally named Medusa. She's not a villain, actually, but a superhero-ish character, part of a group called the Inhumans. Her power? Fittingly, she has extremely long, prehensile hair that she can control at will and use as a weapon or tool, like grabbing things or smacking enemies. No snakes or petrification, just really strong, living hair. Clearly inspired by the idea of a woman whose hair has power. She's generally portrayed as a good guy, or at least morally complex, rather than a monster. If you swing over to DC Comics, they have also toyed with Medusa in their stories. In some Wonder Woman comics, Wonder Woman has to confront Medusa, brought to life somehow in modern times. In one intense storyline, Medusa shows up and causes chaos at one point. She turns an entire crowd of bystanders to stone. Wonder Woman even willingly blinds herself, takes venom to her eyes, in the fight so that she can battle Medusa without risking getting turned to stone. Talk about commitment. Eventually, Diana, Wonder Woman, defeats her, even uses a reflection trick with the inside of her shield if I recall correctly, proving once again that mirrors are a girl's best friend when fighting Gorgons. Old-school horror media has dabbled with the Medusa legend too. There's a 1964 Hammer horror film called The Gorgon. It's set in a 19th century European village where people are mysteriously turning to stone, and it turns out a Gorgon, one of Medusa's sisters, named Megira in the film, is lurking about causing mayhem. It's got that classic Hammer atmosphere, foggy forests, Gothic mansions, but with a Greek myth twist. The Gorgon is portrayed by an actress in spooky makeup. The effects are a bit dated, but charming if you like retro horror. It's an interesting mashup of myth and Victorian horror. Not a super famous movie, but a fun piece of trivia for horror buffs, and it shows that Medusa's fam can carry a story too. Medusa's name even finds its way into everyday language and random things. Ever been to an aquarium or the beach and seen a jellyfish? In many languages, jellyfish are called Medusa. For instance, Medusa in Spanish and Italian, Medusa in French, and so on. Scientifically, the free-swimming form of a jellyfish, the bell with tentacles, is also known as a Medusa stage. Why? Because those dangly tentacles reminded someone of Medusa's snaky hair. And sure enough, jellyfish can give a nasty sting. So maybe there's a parallel there, not turning you to stone, but definitely making you freeze and say, ouch. So if you hear someone abroad say they got stung by a Medusa, they didn't time travel to ancient Greece, it just means a jellyfish got them. There's also a chili pepper named after her, the Medusa pepper. It's a small sweet pepper that grows upright in bunches, kind of looking like a head of snakes sticking up when the plant is full of ripe red peppers. Despite the name, Medusa peppers are actually pretty mild, definitely not stone-cold killers on the Scoville scale. I guess someone thought the pepper's shape looked like Medusa's hairdo. So not everything named Medusa is deadly. In this case, it might just add a little kick to your salad. Historically, the name Medusa made an appearance in a real-life naval disaster too. The French Navy had a frigate, warship, in the early 1800s named Medusa. French for Medusa. Unfortunately, this ship infamously ran aground off the coast of Africa in 1816, and what followed was a horrific survival ordeal. The crew ended up on a makeshift raft. It got very bad. Cannibalism bad. This incident inspired a famous painting called The Raft of the Medusa by Theodore Géricault. The painting depicts the desperate survivors on their raft. It's a powerful artwork and a scathing commentary on incompetence, since the wreck was due to a bungling captain. Now, it's just ironic naming. You have a ship named after a monster known for causing people's doom, and the ship itself ends up in one of the 19th century's most notorious shipwreck scandals. Naming your ship Medusa, maybe not the luckiest choice, in hindsight. On a much lighter note, if you follow high fashion, you've probably seen Medusa's face without even realizing it. The luxury fashion brand Versace uses a stylized Medusa head as its logo. Gianni Versace, the founder, chose Medusa because, according to him, she made people fall in love with her and there was no going back. And he wanted his designs to have that same irresistible effect, minus one assumes turning people to stone. He remembered playing among ancient ruins as a child and seeing the Medusa mosaic, which stuck with him. So when you see that Versace logo on sunglasses or shirts, that's Medusa staring out at you, a symbol of fatal attraction turned to branding. Kinda poetic. Something that in myth was a curse, being so captivating you literally stop people in their tracks, is turned into a selling point for a fashion house. The name Medusa has trickled into language and idioms too. If someone gives you a Medusa stare, it means they're looking daggers at you, a really hateful, icy stare. Thankfully not literally deadly in modern usage. And of course, we use the word petrified to mean extremely scared, which originates from the idea of being turned to stone. That comes straight from stuff like the Medusa myth and similar petrifying legends. We say, "I was petrified" when something scared us stiff, essentially what Medusa's victims experienced quite literally. The concept of a deadly gaze or forbidden glance appears in other stories across cultures too. For example, in the Bible, there's the story of Lot's wife. When fleeing the doomed city of Sodom, she's warned not to look back, but she does, and she turns into a pillar of salt. It's not exactly the same mechanism, divine punishment rather than a monster's power, but it's the same idea of a single look sealing your fate and turning you into an inanimate substance. Lot's wife became a salt statue because she just had to take that peek. It's interesting how looking when you shouldn't shows up as a fatal mistake in various tales. Modern fantasy often borrows the petrification idea but finds new spins. The Harry Potter series, for example, features a basilisk, a giant serpent, in Book 2 that can kill with direct eye contact and petrify if you see it indirectly. In Chamber of Secrets, several characters get petrified instead of killed because they never looked at the basilisk straight on, they saw a reflection or through a camera or a ghost saw it, etc. And how do they cure the petrification? With a potion made from mandrakes. If only the Greeks had thought of a cure. But ancient myths aren't big on curing curses. Usually, a curse is permanent until the monster is slain or some god intervenes. In Greek myth, none of Medusa's stony victims ever got revived as far as the stories say. They were basically considered dead. Maybe someone like Asclepius could have depetrified folks if the myth went that way, but it doesn't come up. So, unlike in Harry Potter, where people are restored after a while, in Perseus' story the people turn to stone stay stone. Speaking of other petrifying creatures, Medusa's deadly gaze isn't the only one in myth. The concept surfaces elsewhere, notably with the basilisk and its cousin the cockatrice in later European folklore, creatures whose look, or even breath, could kill or turn to stone. The basilisk, often called the king of serpents, in medieval lore was sometimes described as a snake or a snake with a roost crown, and it had a lethal gaze much like Medusa's. It's not clear if those legends were directly inspired by Medusa or just independently arrived at the idea that looking at something could be deadly. But clearly the notion of a death glance captured imaginations. It's a pretty terrifying idea, that something as passive as eye contact could be lethal. If looks could kill, indeed, this raises all those fun hypothetical questions like, could Medusa herself be affected by her own power? For instance, could she accidentally turn herself to stone by looking in a mirror or reflective water? According to the myth, the reflection itself is harmless. That's how Perseus managed, by using the mirror shield. So indirect views don't count, otherwise Perseus would have been stoned by looking at her in the shield. And presumably Medusa's own eyeballs are immune to each other. Like she's not turning into stone the moment her two eyes meet or something silly. Her curse was directed outward. And what about her sisters? Are they immune to her gaze? One would assume yes, otherwise the Gorgon family would have had a real problem with accidentally petrifying each other at breakfast. Most likely the Gorgons, being of the same kind, were not affected by each other's gaze. It seems to be a power that only works on mortal beings, and maybe lower gods or creatures. We know gods were immune. Athena wasn't worried about being turned to stone by her own cursed creation, and later stories imply that immortal beings are generally not affected by Medusa. A modern conundrum. What if you looked at Medusa through a camera or a live video feed? By modern logic, that's like looking at a reflection, so probably you'd be safe. In some fantasy media, that trick is used, e.g. using a mirror or a camera viewfinder as a safe way to look at a basilisk or Medusa. I joked about Zoom earlier. If Medusa was on a Zoom call and you were watching on your screen, I think you'd be fine because it's not a direct line of sight. But honestly, I wouldn't want to test it out. One Mythi Cande tidbit. Who was actually immune to Medusa? We've covered that gods likely they're above such things. Also, someone who's blind would effectively be immune, since they can't see her to begin with. There's a logic in some stories that a blind hero wouldn't fear her gaze, though of course then they have the problem of finding her. In D&D and other fantasy, you often have characters fighting a Medusa blindfolded or with eyes shut, relying on other senses. But that's super risky, obviously. The safest bet was the Perseus method. Shiny shield. Keep eyes averted. Use tech. Well, magic tech. Random thought. What about animals? Would Medusa's gaze turn, say, a goat or a bird to stone? Probably yes, any living creature that looked her way, not just humans. Though myths focus on people, I bet she petrified a few unfortunate animals that wandered by. That might explain why the area around her lair was so eerily quiet. All the wildlife was petrified too. And here's a goofy question. What about her own snakes? Could they accidentally catch her eyes and turn to stone? I'd assume not. That'd be a pretty terrible built-in flaw if your hair keeps turning into stone because it saw your face. The snakes were part of her, so I figure they were immune, and probably they don't really have the cognition to look into her eyes in the meaningful sense. They're attached to her head after all. Athena's curse was cruel, but not incompetent enough to make Medusa accidentally stone herself via mirror or her own hair. The theme of a deadly glance or forbidden gaze pops up elsewhere, as we discussed with Lot's wife. And even later in history, people came up with pseudoscientific or magical explanations for things that resemble petrification. For instance, in some old legends or travelers' tales, you hear about the evil eye. The idea that certain people can curse you by a malevolent glare. It's not instant stone, but it's the notion that just a look can do harm. That's a softer echo of the Medusa concept, and it's widespread in various cultures. People wearing amulets against the evil eye, etc. Often those amulets are an eye symbol or, interestingly, a Gorgon face. Yep, those Gorgonian amulets or carvings were basically meant to ward off the evil eye or any evil influence by being an evil eye of sorts. The best defense against a creepy stare is a creepier stare, apparently. One thing notably missing from the Greek myth is any cure for being turned to stone. Once you're stoned, that's it, game over. In some modern fantasies and games, there's usually an antidote or reversal for petrification, like a potion or a spell. But in the original mythos, we don't hear of anyone getting unstoned. Perseus didn't exactly carry around a bag of revival potions. If anything, Greek mythology treats those victims as dead. Perhaps after Medusa was killed, you might wonder, did some of those statues turn back into people? The myths never suggest that. It's like once you've crossed that threshold, sorry, you're marble forever. Imagine if there were a side myth where Asclepius used Medusa's right side blood to reanimate a petrified person. But that's me fanfictioning. There's no such tale in the classical sources. In short, Greek myth didn't really provide a happy ending for Medusa's victims. They were collateral damage. On a thematic note, Medusa's tale isn't the only one in Greek myth where a woman is transformed into a monster as a form of punishment or tragedy. We see a pattern of sorts. For example, Lamia, she was, according to myth, a beautiful queen of Libya who had an affair with Zeus. Hera, Zeus's wife, was enraged and punished Lamia by killing her children and cursing her. Lamia then became a monster, often depicted with a serpent's body or at least serpent features, who preyed on others' children. She's this grief-maddened, demonized figure. Different story details, but there's that theme. A woman wronged by a god or goddess turned into a creature associated with snakes and terror. There's also Arachne, not snake-related but another woman-to-monster story. Arachne dared to say she was better at weaving than Athena. They had a contest. Arachne actually did an amazing job and even weaved scenes that embarrassed the gods. And Athena, in her anger, turned Arachne into a spider. That's how we got spiders, according to myth, as the descendants of Arachne. Again, a woman is transformed as a punishment. In Arachne's case, it was for pride, hubris, whereas in Medusa's, it was for something that wasn't her fault at all. But either way, the result is a new monster or creature in the world. The Greeks used myths like these to explain why certain creepy beings exist. Spiders weave webs because of Arachne. Maybe scary snake-haired beings exist because of Medusa. It was also a way to encode morals or warnings. Don't anger the gods, keep your vows, etc. Although in Medusa's case, the moral is pretty murky unless you twist it into something like, don't brag about your beauty, or the gods will show no mercy. It's intriguing to consider the whole Medusa saga from Medusa's perspective, something the original myth doesn't really give us, but modern storytellers love to explore. Think about it. Medusa was essentially a victim of a god's actions and a goddess's rage. She didn't ask for Poseidon's attention, and she certainly didn't ask to be cursed. After becoming a monster, she isolated herself, presumably to protect others as much as to be left alone, since any living thing that stumbled on her would die. Along comes Perseus, a heavily armed stranger with divine backing, sneaking into her home while she sleeps and cutting off her head. From Medusa's point of view, it's not like she was rampaging through villages. People came to her to kill her, essentially. In a sense, her story is one of someone who was wronged, then hunted down for having the audacity to exist as a cursed being. It's pretty tragic. No wonder so many modern adaptations give Medusa a sympathetic twist. We tend nowadays to ask, what did the monster feel? What's their side of the story? In the case of Medusa, that opens up a lot of pathos. Some retellings portray her almost like a tragic anti-heroine, still deadly, but with a glimmer of her former self inside, regretting her fate. It's similar to how we've re-examined other villains in pop culture, Wicked's Elphaba, the Witch of the West, or Maleficent in the Angelina Jolie movies, taking the so-called evil witch/monster and telling the tale from her side. Medusa is ripe for that kind of story because, frankly, she was treated unfairly by the powers that be. One thing I find intriguing is how the ancient Greeks themselves viewed the Medusa myth. Was it just a spooky story to them, or did they kind of believe in it on some level? Obviously, they didn't think a snake-haired woman was actually lurking out there turning folks to stone, at least not by the classical period. Maybe as a super ancient fear somewhere? Hard to say, but they definitely treated her image as something powerful. That suggests that while the literal story was myth, the symbolic power of Medusa was real to them. Carving her face on a temple was thought to actually guard the place. So in a religious or cultural sense, Medusa the symbol was taken seriously. The myth itself also served as a great narrative. I can imagine it being a popular story to tell around a fire or in a festival. It's dramatic, it's got a clear heroic arc, and a fantastical element. Greek mythology was multi-purpose. Part entertainment, part spiritual/cultural education, part explanation of natural phenomena. With Medusa, on one hand they explain things like why Libya has snakes or why certain shields have scary faces, and on the other hand they set up a tale of a brave hero overcoming impossible odds with help from the gods, reinforcing piety perhaps. The Romans, who inherited the Greek myths, also loved Medusa's image. They used the Gorgonian on mosaics, cameos, architecture, you name it. The Romans might put a Medusa head on the breastplate of their busts of Athena/Minerva, or even wear rings with a Gorgon head carved into them. It was like a general symbol for warding off evil or bad luck. Sort of how people today might wear a cross or a protective charm. In Roman times, a Gorgon amulet could fill that role for some. So even as the story of Perseus and Medusa was just one myth among many, the image and idea of Medusa permeated the culture as something significant and potent. Also, the Perseus versus Medusa showdown is kind of the template for a classic monster slayer story. Think about it. A hero given special tools, facing a creature that will kill him if he makes one wrong move, and using brains, not just brawn, to win. It's like an early blueprint for so many fantasy adventures where the hero has to learn the monster's weakness and exploit it. The idea of a monster whose gaze can kill and the solution being a reflective shield. That's some pretty clever plotting for an ancient tale. It's no wonder it endured. It's exciting and has that problem-solving element. In a way, Perseus versus Medusa is an early boss fight narrative. You can't just hack and slash blindly, you need strategy and maybe some godly cheat codes. Perseus even gets a flying horse out of the whole deal like a bonus prize. How many heroes get to ride off on a brand new Pegasus at the end of their quest? Speaking of Pegasus, it's funny how one of the most majestic, positive symbols in Greek myth, the winged horse Pegasus, symbol of inspiration and freedom, literally came out of one of the grisliest moments. Pegasus is born from Medusa's severed neck, yet Pegasus goes on to have a life of his own in myths, helping the hero Bellerophon defeat the Chimera, and then becoming a constellation, etc. Today, Pegasus might be more famous than Medusa in some ways. Pegasus is on corporate logos, car models, you name it, often as a sign of speed or creativity. And most people who see Pegasus imagery don't immediately think, hey, that came out of Medusa's neck. It's an example of how myths can birth spin-offs that take on their own significance separate from their origins. Medusa's death, horrible as it was, spawned something beautiful and immortal. Literally immortal. Pegasus is a divine horse. There's some poetic idea in that from tragedy comes a new hope or whatever. The Greeks didn't explicitly moralize that, but we can read into it if we want. Random modern reference. There's a 1978 thriller film called The Medusa Touch. It doesn't have Medusa in it, but the title is metaphorical. The story is about a man who has psychic powers that cause disasters. Like he can unintentionally make things blow up or crash just by focusing on them. They call it the Medusa Touch because everything he figuratively sets eyes on gets destroyed. It's a neat example of how Medusa's name and concept get used even when the actual myth isn't involved, just as shorthand for a deadly gaze or influence. For the astronomy buffs, there's even a star and an asteroid named after Medusa. In the constellation Perseus, there's a star called Algol, which is actually a binary star that dims and brightens periodically. The name Algol comes from Arabic Ras al-Ghul, meaning the demon's head. Historically, it was associated with the head of Medusa that Perseus is carrying. Ancient stargazers noticed Algol's weird blinking. It's actually two stars eclipsing each other, but they didn't know that. So they imagined it as the eye of the Gorgon, opening and closing. How cool and creepy is that? So when you look up at Perseus in the night sky, know that one of those stars was long thought to represent Medusa's winking, malevolent head. As for the asteroid, 149 Medusa is a real main-belt asteroid, discovered in 1875. Astronomers often name asteroids after mythological figures, so Medusa got her rock in space. Don't worry, it's not turning other asteroids to stone up there. It's just orbiting the sun like a regular space rock. But it's pretty cool knowing there's literally a chunk of space named Medusa. Oh, and paleontology fans. There's a genus of extinct prehistoric predators named Gorgonopsids, Gorgon faces. These were ferocious saber-toothed creatures back in the Permian period, even before dinosaurs. They got the name because their skulls with big fangs looked pretty fearsome, like the Gorgon of myth. No snake hair on these guys, they looked more like a weird reptilian mammal with big teeth. But the paleontologists clearly thought, scary, deadly. Let's name it after the Gorgons. There's also a dinosaur named Medusaceratops, Medusa hornface. It's a relative of Triceratops discovered in Montana. It got that name because its frill, the shield-like thing on the back of its head, has curvy, spiky ornamentation that someone thought looked like a tangle of snakes. So the scientists said, hey, Medusa, The dino itself was a plant eater and definitely didn't turn anyone to stone, but the shape of its horns inspired the name. That's another fun way the Medusa myth finds its way into science. Sometimes I wonder what Medusa would think if she knew how famous she became. Imagine telling her, in a few thousand years, people will use your face as a fashion logo, name space rocks and dinosaurs after you, and write stories sympathizing with you. She'd probably be baffled. They what? I get turned into a monster and then everyone wants to put my face on their stuff? It's weird immortality. Not the living forever she might have wanted, but living forever as an image and a story. In a strange way, Athena's curse did make Medusa immortal. Not in body, but in memory and culture. We're still talking about her, depicting her in art, and invoking her name long after mortal figures from that era are forgotten. They say art is how you become immortal. Well, Medusa has been a subject of art and story for millennia. So in a roundabout way, she outlived all the heroes and gods who wronged her, at least in our collective imagination. Romantic poets and modern writers have found Medusa fascinating as well. The English poet Percy Bysshe Shelley wrote a poem about Medusa, inspired by a painting he saw, which at the time he thought was by Leonardo da Vinci, showing Medusa's head. Shelley describes Medusa in almost entranced terms, both horrific and beautiful. The poem empathizes with her to some extent, portraying her gaze as sad and deadly, capturing that mix of pity and fear. Later on, the poet Sylvia Plath wrote a poem titled Medusa that many interpret as being about her relationship with her mother, using Medusa imagery to convey being smothered or petrified by someone's overwhelming presence. So Medusa as a metaphor pops up in literature for all sorts of psychological states. Lethal beauty, paralyzing fear, feminine rage, victimization, you name it. She's rich in symbolism. Even TV shows have tried fresh takes on Medusa. The BBC series Atlantis, 2013 to 2015, had a storyline where Medusa is actually a kind, shy young woman who becomes friends with the main characters, Jason and his buddies, long before her curse. Over the series, you see Medusa being slowly, tragically cursed, knowing it's coming but being unable to stop it. Eventually, she does turn into the snake-haired Gorgon. With tears in her eyes as it happens, it's heartbreaking, and one of her friends, who loves her, ends up having to, well, deal with her in the classic way. The show basically took you on a journey of caring about Medusa as a person first, so when she becomes the monster, it's super tragic. They really leaned into the she's a victim of fate angle. It was an interesting approach, even if the show itself took a lot of liberties with Greek myths. But it goes to show how storytellers now are keen to explore Medusa's humanity. In the gaming world beyond story-driven console games, Medusa often appears in multiplayer or arcade games. For instance, in the MOBA game Smite, you can play as Medusa. She's a ranged character who can literally use her ultimate ability to turn enemies to stone, momentarily, in the middle of a battle. In the old NES game Kid Icarus, Medusa was one of the villains because Kid Icarus/Pit is loosely based on Perseus, It's a whole mash of Greek myths, actually. The fact that she slots so easily into games shows how iconic her gimmick is. Everybody knows the rules. If Medusa shows up, don't look at her. Or if you do, expect a game over screen. On a more academic note, people have long tried to interpret where the Medusa legend came from, in terms of cultural origins or psychological symbolism. Some scholars suggest that the Gorgon myth might have roots in real human experiences of horror. One theory posits that the Gorgon's face, with its wide eyes and lolling tongue, resembles the appearance of a severed human head, which in ancient warfare might be displayed by victors to terrorize their enemies. Gruesome, but that happened. A decapitated head can have bulging, vacant eyes and a tongue sticking out, basically what Gorgon heads look like in art. So Medusa's severed head wielded as a weapon could be a mythologized version of the idea of using a gruesome trophy head to scare people. Also, there could be an element of cautionary tale about not disrespecting the gods. Medusa was either boastful or simply unlucky, and either way suffered a god's wrath. Some anthropologists and mythologists have noted that many cultures have a concept of an evil eye or deadly vision. It might stem from a very deep human fear of being watched by something dangerous or the superstitious belief that envy or evil intent can harm through a glance. Medusa is like the ultimate personification of the evil eye concept. She is the evil eye in a way weaponized. Another angle is that Medusa might have originated from an older deity or folklore figure that was later demonized. There's speculation that perhaps in some pre-Greek or proto-Greek culture, there was a fierce snake goddess or a mask used in rituals, and the Greeks turned that into a monster in their mythology. The name Medusa, meaning guardian, hints she might have once been more of a protective figure, as her image turned out to be. Some feminist scholars have even suggested Medusa represents an ancient memory of matriarchal religions that the later Greeks, with their patriarchal gods, subjugated, hence the story of a patriarchal hero slaying her. Those theories are largely speculative, but it's interesting to think about. And speaking of fear of snakes, that's one of the most common phobias. Snakes have always been a bit of an archetype of danger in human minds with good reason. Some are venomous. Medusa basically embodies snake fear plus human fear rolled together psychologically. She hits a lot of primal buttons: venomous animals, snakes, death turning to lifeless stone, and the uncanny mixing of human and not human. That's one reason her image endures as effectively scary and fascinating. She's literally a human face. With animal elements and a lethal power, our brains both recognize her as a person and recoil from her as a thing. In psychology terms, she's a great example of the monstrous feminine archetype, which fascinates and terrifies because it subverts expectations. Women are traditionally seen as givers of life, but here she is dealing death. One more fun detour because Medusa's myth centers so much on looking/seeing. Her story is often brought up in discussions about art and perception. In a way, she represents an image, her face, that is so powerful it kills the viewer. That's a pretty extreme version of the power of art/image. There's even a term in psychology called the Medusa effect, used in some studies about how people attribute mind or agency to images, like feeling a portrait is watching you, so her name pops up in academic analogies too. Now here's a cosmic tidbit we touched on. There's a star in Perseus called Algol, historically linked to Medusa's eye. Algol's sometimes nicknamed the demon star. To the naked eye it dims and brightens, which ancient people found spooky. In modern astronomy, Algol is a well-studied eclipsing binary. One star passes in front of the other, causing the dip in brightness every 3 days, so we now know why it winks. But how cool is it that an ancient myth was kind of encoded in the stars? Perseus is up there eternally holding the Gorgon's head, and the head is literally a variable star. There's also an old persistent question among fans of mythology in all these tales of petrification: what happens to the soul of the person turned to stone? The Greeks might not have thought about it explicitly, but later interpreters did. If you turn to stone, are you dead? Soul moves on, or are you trapped inside? Most portrayals imply you're dead effectively, but some modern stories play with the idea. Being petrified is like being in suspended animation, maybe fully conscious but unable to move. Now that's horrifying, like in Narnia's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. The White Witch turns creatures to stone, and later Aslan revives them. Those creatures seem to have been conscious, or at least alive, under the enchantment, because once freed they continue as if no time passed. If we applied that to Medusa's victims, yeesh, that would be even more awful to be stuck as rock-aware and waiting. Thankfully, Greek myth doesn't say that. It would add an extra layer of horror that might derail the heroics. It was cleaner to treat it as death, and for completeness, Perseus himself eventually had more adventures. After all this, he and Andromeda settled in Tiryns in Greece. There was a prophecy that Perseus would one day kill his grandfather Acrisius, the one who had tried to kill Perseus as a baby because of an oracle's warning. Sure enough, years later, Perseus participates in some athletic games and accidentally throws a discus that veers off and strikes an old man in the crowd who turns out to be Acrisius. Talk about a freak accident fulfilling fate. So Perseus felt bad about that and ended up trading the kingdom of Argos, which should have been his by inheritance, with another king and ruled elsewhere peacefully. Compared to a lot of Greek heroes, Perseus's later life was pretty tame. He didn't die horribly or anything. He actually lived to old age and was eventually placed among the stars by Athena. The Perseus constellation. In myths, many heroes have tragic downfalls, but Perseus got one of the nicer happily ever afters, aside from that accidental grandpa slaying. Which Greek tragedy? What can you do? Alright, I think that just about covers it. Either way, thanks for sticking around for these stupid Medusa facts. It's been a journey from ancient Greece to modern Manhattan, from jellyfish to dinosaurs to designer fashion. Who knew snake-haired monsters could touch so many parts of our world? Mythology is wild. Now I'm going to gently set down this metaphorical mirror shield and tiptoe out of here before any snakes start hissing. You get some rest, dream of pleasant Things may be winged horses and heroic adventures, definitely not snake-haired ladies. And remember, if some problem in your life seems overwhelming, just think at least it's not literally turning people to stone. That's one less issue to deal with. Take care, sleep well, and until next time, don't stare too deeply into the darkness. You never know what might be staring back. Good night.